Thanks. So, my talk's called Fringe IA. I don't know if any of you guys are fans of the TV show. Imagine one at least. It's a shame it ended. So this was actually a talk that I gave last year at the IA Summit in Baltimore. But I've added a bunch of stuff and changed some things around a little bit. So what is Fringe IA? Well, it's not that. It's not wireframes and things like that. So I'm thinking about Fringe as a concept in several different ways. It ties to science through the TV show. That's really why I use the TV show hook there. But it also is related to the fact that IA kind of sits between a lot of disciplines. It tends to be on the fringe of various different disciplines. And also within the IA community itself, there's a lot of folks doing some really interesting stuff that's kind of on the fringe of IA. I mean, most people when they think about IA and their companies and things, they're looking at taxonomy and the old school, like the Morville and Rosenfeld book, the Polar Bear book. But it's a lot more than that, and it's definitely changing things like pervasive IA. The idea that, well, actually a lot of the stuff that Corey talked about earlier, the anthropological stuff. So as far as the IA part goes, Jorge Arango last year wrote a blog post that's been referenced several times at different conferences, but he defined information architecture as concerned with the structural integrity of meaning across contexts. And if you think about what Corey and some of the other folks have said today, that's kind of how it plays in. I mean, it's meaning, and I'll go a little bit more deep into this later, but and it's figuring out what the meaning is, figuring out what meaning you want to impart into what you're doing, and how it's connected to everything else. Across contexts can be within your software products and things, or it can be the real world and virtual world and that kind of stuff. So where am I going to start? Well, have any of you guys heard of James Burke, the Connections TV program? So he's a British guy that did this history of science show back in the 70s. He's been doing some things recently too. In fact, he spoke at the Strata conference just a few days ago. But he says that we should look to the past to kind of better understand what's going on in the history of science and technology. And I think that applies to us as well. He said the future hasn't happened yet, obviously, and the future is really just the present with some extra bits attached. I'm not sure how I started this.
Go to the next slide.
Okay, cool. So, Mr. Burke from 1978, do you have anything to tell us here today?
Some, I think, that the key to why things change is the key to everything. How easy is it for knowledge to spread? And that in the past, the people who made change happen were the people who had that knowledge, whether they were craftsmen or kings. Today, the people who make things change, the people who have that knowledge, are the scientists and the technologists who are the true driving force of humanity. And before you say, what about the Beethovens, the Michelangelos? Let me suggest something with which you may disagree violently. That at best, the products of human emotion, art, philosophy, politics, music, literature, are interpretations of the world that tell you more about the guy who's talking than about the world he's talking about. Second-hand views of the world made third-hand by your interpretation of them. Things like that, as opposed to this. Know what it is? It's a bunch of amino acids, the stuff that goes to build up a worm, or a geranium, or you. This stuff's easy to take, isn't it? Understandable. Got people in it. This scientific knowledge is hard to take because it removes the reassuring crutches of opinion, ideology, and leaves only what is demonstrably true about the world. And the reason why so many people may be thinking about throwing away those crutches is because, thanks to science and technology, they have begun to know that they don't know so much, and that if they're to have more say in what happens to their lives, more freedom to develop their abilities to the full, they have to be helped towards that knowledge that they know exists and that they don't possess. And by help towards that knowledge, I don't mean give everybody a computer and say help yourself. Where would you even start? No, I mean trying to find ways to translate the knowledge, to teach us to ask the right questions. See, we're on the edge of a revolution in communications technology that is going to make that more possible than ever before. Or, if that's not done, to cause an explosion of knowledge that will leave those of us who don't have access to it as powerless as if we were deaf, dumb, and blind. And I don't think most people want that. So what do we do about it? I don't know. But maybe a good start would be to recognize within yourself the ability to understand anything, because that ability is there, as long as it's explained clearly enough. And then go and ask for explanations. And if you're thinking right now, what have I asked for? Ask yourself if there's anything in your life that you want changed. That's where it starts.
So I'm hoping you saw how with everything else that's been going on today. I hope you weren't focused on his predictive quality in this, but more on the words he was using and the fact that you guys are the ones that are doing this. And it hasn't already happened, right? It's happening right now. And it's going to continue to happen as every new technology comes along. I also want to mention Richard Feynman here, just for a quote that he had. He didn't really like titles that much. And the idea that we need to look at what something does to understand it, rather than look at what it's called. I mean, certainly looking at the name of something tells you a little bit, but actually watching it and trying to understand it tells you a lot more. So that's what I'm going to try to do here with some of the stuff that's been going on in the IA movement recently. First, though, I want to look back to the past again. So Burke said, he mentioned about knowing that we don't know. And Richard Saul Wurman is one of, I'm sure, many people, that kind of took that as a topic and wrote about it. So information anxiety was a good thing he wrote, but it was kind of dealing with that gap in knowledge and how that's a real problem and there needs to be people working on that. Some other ideas that came from Wurman, incidentally, he's the guy that coined the term information architecture in the 70s, or at least one of the people. Understanding is not about simplification and minimalization. It's about organization and clarification. The creative organization of information creates new information. That actually, I thought of this when Joshua was giving his talk earlier about photography, because he said something pretty similar, even though he was talking about photography and this is IA stuff. It's all the same thing. But the whole idea that by reorganizing content, by taking information that's there and sort of reinterpreting it, you can create something new, something with different meaning, something with different use. It's also this idea of what versus how. So Wurman talked about the fact that there's what people and how people. The what people are more concerned about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, what we want to do with these things. The how people are concerned with how we're going to build it. I think folks that naturally identify with information architecture tend to be more what people. Dan Klein has talked about that too. He actually took that concept and related it to Jesse James Garrett's elements of user experience diagram, and he broke it out. It actually breaks out pretty easily. One half is the what, one half is the how, and it turns out the what half is the architecture and the how half is the design. So it's not so much that it's different activities as it is different perspectives and what you care about most when you're working on the project that you're working on. Dan also has come up with this way of characterizing information architecture that I think is useful. Although, well, so I do use it in a lot of work, but I don't use the technical terms because I think they're confusing for, well, anybody that's not an IA or in this room. So ontology, taxonomy, and choreography, they're easy to throw around, but I think meaning, the parts and their arrangement, and the interaction between the parts, the rules, people get that. I mean, that's simple language that is understandable. So you can talk about, for a given project, what are the parts? What is the meaning inherent in the parts that you have? What's the meaning you're trying to get out of them when you put them together and reorder them? What do you need to add or remove from it? And the choreography is the interaction between the parts. So, different interactions between the things can result in something completely different. And also something with different meaning. Incidentally, there's a ton of models for IA and UX and their relationships and stuff. Somebody just recently, the end of January, I guess, posted a presentation with 195 different models. So you can pretty much pick your favorite. Dan's is just one that I find useful, but if you get a chance, these slides will be posted like everybody else's. There's links all throughout here, and you can check this out. It's actually kind of interesting to see all the different ways you can characterize information architecture, either within user experience or outside of user experience, or one's a part of the other, or they aren't related at all, or whatever. There's logical reasons to do lots of different things. This is the final, second to last. Another idea from recent IA work, and this is also one of Dan's, is that IA sort of fits between business and user experience. Now this isn't, these lines on the right here aren't hard and fast. I mean, it's not like there's a division here. But just sort of the idea that on one side you've got coding, building, the people that actually create the stuff. And then design, people that figure out how it's going to sort of work and feel and that sort of thing. But the IA is a little bit different. I mean, it's focused more on the information part of it, right? The structures in the information, the structures that you need to add to the information. And so we have all kinds of different tools. Again, that's not a complete list of all the different things that IAs do, but just the idea that it sort of sits between. This came up quite a few times at the IA Summit last year, the whole reframing concept. In fact, there was a special workshop at the start of the summit. I have a slide about that. There was a post on Twitter, well, it actually was a post on a blog somewhere that was shared around on Twitter shortly after the summit last year that was talking about why. And I'm sure you guys have probably heard of the 5 whys and that sort of thing. I mean, just asking questions is a good way to approach problem solving. But this idea of reframing problems seems to be, if it's not unique to IA, we definitely have tools and an approach, I think, that lends itself to that. The idea that, what kind of model do we need to create to understand this thing better? And it's not like there's just a fixed set of models either, right? I mean, you're creating a new one every time you approach a new problem. You might be able to leverage stuff you've done before, but it's usually different. So this Reframe IA workshop, they're doing another one. This year it's on education. Last year it was actually Reframing IA. That's where the name came from. Like, how do you define it? What does it mean right now? What's going on in it? Because it was pretty clear that it had moved past the old polar bear book and that sort of thing. But there were some other ideas, the architect versus builder thing, meaning what it is, do we create it, do we discover it? So there's a bunch of stuff out there on the web, and also there's going to be a book published about that too, eventually. This is a handy little way me to characterize sort of the philosophy behind information architecture. This was from Abby Gobert and Dan Klein. I've found this useful personally, just because it kind of helps me keep on track. It kind of reminds me why I like doing what I do. And it also reminds me when I'm not doing what I want to do. So I intend to make the unclear clear, put the what before the how, facilitate understanding, organize meaning, create clarity and establish truth, support goals, makers, and users. Like I say, it's more of a philosophical kind of thing, but I think it's interesting. And hopefully you also see some ties back to Bergstein, because he used a lot of the same language. Totally unrelated, but there it is. Jesse James Garrett at the IA Summit in 2009, in a very, well, now famous presentation he gave at the end. He gave a keynote, or plenary. He said a lot of really interesting things, and that sort of kicked off the whole UX as a popular thing as it is now, and distinctions between that and IA. But one of the things he said was, this is not a process of invention, this is a process of discovery. And that leads me into part of what this talk is about, the whole science angle. So I stumbled onto this book, sometime last year, possibly. It's quite old, it's from 1957. And it was written by someone who was looking at science and arguing that there's actually a lot of art in it. There's a lot of creativity in science. And that's rarely acknowledged and understood. And so he spent some time researching that and put this book together. It's also free, probably because it's an older publication, but it's out there on the web. So discovery should come as an adventure rather than as the result of a logical process of thought. I think that applies to IA too. If you're trying to just crank through the deliverables for your project, you're not going to get as much out of them. Right? I mean, you can make your wireframes, you can do your process flows, you can do your personas, you can do all your different things. But if you're just making them for the sake of making them, it's not going to do much for you. If you've actually looked back, like I mentioned before, at the meaning, why you're doing these things, you'll get a lot more out of it. And if you treat it as an adventure and a process of discovery, that might help too. Intuitions always appear at the fringe of consciousness, not at the focus. The great scientist must be regarded as a creative artist, and it is quite false to think of the scientist as a man who merely follows rules of logic and experiment. Again, this was written quite a while ago. But I think that applies to us too. And especially this. Think about, big data and everything else. The most difficult mental act of all is to rearrange a familiar bundle of data, to look at it differently and escape from the prevailing doctrine. I think that's partly what I is about. So, Craig Peters, I was trying to think of, in an earlier talk today, showed the continuum thing. It is slightly different from this. I made a comment on Twitter about it at the time. But Dan had come up with this performance continuums thing. Just another tool, a way to sort of compare ideas. So I used it here just to kind of make a note that tools are something we need to look at a little bit more too, I think. There's a lot of tools out there, obviously. I mean, there's a lot of established tools, Azure, Autograph, things like that. But what I don't see people doing as much, or at least they aren't talking about it in conferences and things, is creating their own tools to get their work done. They try to find, quite often they try to find ways to use existing tools, which makes sense because you don't have to build something new all the time. But I think a lot of times the problems that we're trying to solve are very unique, and you might need to consider adapting to something weird, something different, something that wasn't designed for the type of problem you're trying to solve, but that happens to be useful because the way it handles the information is the same way that you need to handle the information. And you might be able to learn from that. I've got an example from my own work coming up. So, I'm in Seattle, and I work at ProQuest now. We used to be called Serial Solutions. They retired that name just a few weeks ago. And like Amy said, we basically make software for life. So it's more for managing the resources that librarians have to deal with, but also end users see our stuff too. Search tools and things like that for people's collections. So last year, a project fell into my lap where we have, okay, so we have a search and discovery tool. So given your collection at your library, you want people to be able to find things that are right. People customize our tool, and everybody customizes it differently. And when it was built out, we allowed for lots of customizations and things. But last year, technology on our side changed. And this was something that needed to be migrated to a new system and a new way of doing things without actually breaking anything, right? And actually, in a way, without the customers even knowing about it because they didn't need to. The problem, though, was it grew organically over time with the old system. So nobody really understood what all mattered in the configuration files that we had. And we had thousands of them. And so it was XML and JSON and stuff like that. But the problem was figuring out what they actually meant. It wasn't a case of copying data from one field to another, because sometimes it was used one way and sometimes it was used another. It was complicated. So also some of the files were being used by current clients, and some were just legacy for clients that had left. Some were for trial demo clients. So we weren't really sure how many needed to be migrated. And that was a problem. And it's not something that we could just write a script to go through and dig through and spit out some results, because it takes a person to understand what's actually going on in these files and what's being used and how it's being used. So it wasn't a matter of mapping data from one place to another. First we had to understand it before we could do anything. So yeah, that was kind of a challenge. And I had stumbled across this Tiddlywiki thing back when I was in grad school. It's got a silly name, but it's a note-taking tool, or at least that's what it was designed for. People have been using it for all kinds of weird stuff lately, including me. But if you think about it in a very abstract sense, what this thing gives you is the ability to create named chunks of content, uniquely named chunks of content, with optional tags. And there's a bunch of plugins that people have written so that they can enhance their note-taking abilities. But those plugins are also kind of useful if you're doing other stuff with information that you stick in a Tiddlywiki. The way it's implemented, it's basically an HTML page with a bunch of JavaScript, and it's been around for quite a while. It was kind of ahead of its time, but I don't think very many people knew about it. It's still being maintained. In fact, there's a new version of it now. But it's all a single file, right? So your data is stored in the same HTML page, along with the JavaScript that runs the whole thing. It has search capabilities. It has all kinds of stuff built in. But the point is, it was useful to me, or at least I thought it would be useful to me, and it turned out it was. If I could get the data into the right format, if I could put the data into a Tiddlywiki easily, and then start playing with it, and sort of exploring it and experimenting with it, I might be able to actually do this thing. So that's what I did. And it took some time, and it took some playing around. But a lot of these different pieces came from plugins that already existed for a Tiddlywiki. It's just that that thing was meant for note-taking, and I was using it for analyzing data. So things like graphs, simple pie charts and bar graphs. This was something I put in to show churn over time. So the business on the right-hand side, actually, go back. That timeline on the right-hand side, I don't know if you can see, but there's dates and it's all worded that way. That's something you get for free with the Tiddlywiki, because when you put data into it, everything has a author or editor name and a date when it was changed last. Actually, a date when it was created and it changed last. So I just took the date information from the Git tree where we were storing all these config files, pulled that in, stuck it in the right place in the Tiddlywiki, and now I had a timeline for free. The trick, though, was getting it in the right format. it was easier than building a tool or trying to find a tool, but it did take some time. And the same goes for the graph data. It's just feeding off of that same data. To be able to work with it, though, I needed to look at lists of different config files. Ideally, what I was trying to do and what I ended up doing was grouping these things together. Right? I wanted to make it so that it was going to be a manual process doing this migration anyway, but I wanted to chunk it up so that I could find similar configurations that could all be changed at once. And so the way I went about that was, at least at the start, with a bunch of tables and kind of broke things out that way. But under the hood, this graph, and the same is true for a lot of this other stuff, it's just a little bit of code, right? It's a little bit of script code that pulls the data that I already stuck in the thing and displays it in a different way. Since this was a manual process, and there's a lot of files that needed to be changed, I also sort of built the process into the tool. So that, I mean, it's not pretty, it wasn't meant to be pretty, it was just meant to be functional. But because like I say, this is an internal thing. This isn't something that customers would have seen. But each of those sections in that table there are just steps in the process to make sure that you don't skip one and that everything is taken care of. I also included some diffing stuff, again through plugins that already exist. So it's nice to be able to see the changes in the configuration files over time and things like that, or to be able to compare different configurations. The search, though, in the Tiddler Wiki is probably the most useful thing of all. Like if you have a ton of text content and you want to easily search it without doing command line tools or sticking it in a content management system or anything huge like that, if you can stick it in a Tiddler Wiki, they've got some really sophisticated searching capabilities. You can search on tags, you can search on just strings inside the content, and lots of other things too. Like I say, you get that for free if you can actually get your data in, right? One of the last things I did with it was did this color coding thing, because I realized since I was trying to chunk stuff off, I needed to be able to see those natural divisions. And over time, I figured out how to group things together based on the stuff that I saw on the data. But I ended up just sort of doing a hash and attaching colors to it so that I could see which particular configurations matched up. So, why did I talk about all that? Well, I think information architects kind of need the freedom to experiment and play. I think being able to do that, I was lucky enough in the job that I have that I was allowed to do that, but I think that's the only way we got to a solution that worked. Sometimes we need to be tool builders. I'm not saying you have to code or anything like that, but you at least have to understand more about the weird tools that are out there. I mean, the internet's full of lots of useful stuff. The trick is being able to find it, right? And to know if it's actually useful for the thing you're trying to do. So if you're aware of a little bit of what's under the hood, you can get a better idea of whether a particular tool might be useful for you. You don't just have to stick to the standard IA tools or UX tools. And I think we can also learn from scientific discovery and their approach. And then from the work video, know what you don't know. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. You have to admit that you don't know, and you have to sort of embrace that, and you have to want to do something about that. Also, helping others understand. That's kind of why we're here, I think. Translating knowledge. Not translating it into what you think it needs to be, but into what you see it needs to be, based on what you've learned about the problem and the user research you've done, and all of that. Also, just asking questions, asking lots of questions. I think we're pretty good at that, but I think we need to keep doing that too. And explaining clearly. Obviously, that's a big part of information architecture. But also asking for clear explanations from others too. I mean, the people that we're working with. Because we all need to be able to understand each other to be able to solve any of these problems. And that's where